No worries, BAM, it doesn't seem too dangerous. Bang, it's only the one after all. Crash. It sounds like an elephant in a china shop. And it's doing the Macarena. Elephant Macarena, Nicole, believe me, it's fine. I know how to deal with rats if I have to. Wham! Says the guy who had to be saved from them. There was over 40 of them. Thud. The weird multi-armed torso rat definitely wasn't the most agile thing around, but it was plenty strong. It must have smelled something it wanted further down the hall, because now it was chasing the entire crowd of civilians in front of it to try and get past them. Whenever it caught up to a person it would grab them with its 8 arms, sniff them while they screamed, and then throw them angrily to the side. Definitely still hunting mutants. I was blending in with the panicked crowd, waiting for a good moment to slip away. I had absolutely no interest in getting pulled into a fight right now, not in such a public setting. There would be guards coming to deal with this soon, and even I could predict that the heroes might show for an emergency at the hospital. Being arrested right now was not appealing in the slightest. The rat grabbed a woman, sniffed her, she screamed, and threw her to the side. The crowd of people was starting to thin a bit as people ran down side corridors or were knocked to the floor, but then a dull roar down one of the intersecting hallways had some of the humans running back into the main crowd. That was bad. A second stitched creature appeared from the intersecting corridor, this one with an intact mutant man's body that had a chitinous carapace, but with a Nessie's neck and a rat's head. The two joined up and continued chasing the crowd. If I was gauging their behavior correctly. Yup. A third stitch creature was flanking the crowd from the next intersection. They might be heavily modified, but the stitch creatures were still using rat hunting tactics. Both myself and the crowd were being herded. Hey Nicole, I'm gonna have to call you back. What? Alright, but call me back when you're safe. I will. I hung up the phone, resolving to alter my version of events a bit when I retold them to her later. There was absolutely no way I was letting Nicole know I got herded by rats a second time. Let's see, I had to make this look as normal as possible and get it done quick. The best thing would be to get something large and heavy to bludgeon the rats with. Avoid making them bleed, humans panic at the sight of blood. I spotted a fire suppression canister in a case embedded into the wall. Shoving my way past a few running people, I grabbed the tab on the case that said, "Lift here," and wrenched the lid off. Then I grabbed the canister. It wasn't as heavy as I would have liked, but it was solid, and if Mikey's horror movies were any indication, bashing something's brains in with a fire suppression canister was common enough to not panic the crowd. I slowed down and let people run past me. The two stitched creatures approached, and I angled for the one with the long neck. Just a bit further. The stitched creature came in range and I swung the canister at its head. The metal canister slammed into the underside of the long-necked creature's chin, throwing its head up in a wide arch and breaking its jaw. The head flopped backwards over its own shoulder, and a moment later the rest of the creature followed, toppling onto the floor. It didn't try to get up. That was easier than expected. The 8-armed creature blinked in confusion at the sudden absence of its partner, before attempting another hiss bellow and swinging its arms at me. I ducked underneath the first swing, but with 8 arms it was able to land hits through sheer numbers. I couldn't dodge all of them while appearing human, and eventually 3 of its arms grabbed my sides. It attempted to lift me up and throw me. And failed. I was simply too heavy for it, and with an entire 8-armed torso crudely grafted to the front of a rat body, its center of balance was terribly placed for heavy lifting. Its hindquarters lifted off the ground before I did, and I used its resulting moment of confusion to slam it in the face with the canister. Once, twice, and then it roughly shoved me away to spare itself more head trauma. The rat thing covered its head with its arms, trying to get its bearings, before suddenly flailing and roaring. I was about to step in for another attempt and a shoe flew over my shoulder and bounced off the rat creature's torso. It didn't do any damage, but the rat paused to watch the boot hit the floor. I turned to find that several humans had started to grab anything they could to arm themselves. Boxes, medical equipment, the one human who took off her boots and had already thrown the first. One especially large man had dumped the medicine off a metal trolley, and was lifting the whole thing over his head to brace it for use as a bludgeoning object. This human ran forward and slammed the trolley onto the rat, unbalancing both of them. While he recovered, other humans began throwing their objects, or directly hit the rat with their makeshift weapons if they were feeling brave. The third rat creature that had tried to flank the crowd wasn't doing any better. The humans near it had also gathered weapons. One had somehow found a metal baseball bat, and proceeded to beat it to death in short order. That one hadn't had any real protective enhancements, and didn't last nearly as long as the 8-armed rat. Very interesting behavior from the humans. I did not expect them to turn on the rat creatures in such a manner. Most civilians I encountered always ran, and I had assumed it their default behavior in dangerous situations. My successful attack on the rat creatures must have galvanized the crowd into going on the offensive. Indeed, the rat creatures didn't really have any weapons beyond physical strength, and it wasn't like 3 rat creatures outnumbered such a large crowd. It had only taken a visual example of seeing one human prevail to make the group realize an alternate, and better, method of survival existed. I'd definitely have to remember this tactic for next time. The crowd slowly started to filter back towards the exits, some of them clutching their weapons while checking around corners, others helping those who had trouble walking due to injury or just frayed nerves. A few of the more proactive humans did that weird ritual where they hit my shoulder, and congratulated me on my martial prowess, or on the size of my testicles. I'd never even bothered forming them, a waste of resources. Confusing. As the crowd walked out, I passed by the corpse of the third rat creature. It had been more or less pulped, nothing more than a red pile of meat with no real features. Technically the rat creatures were much stronger than any one human, even most mutants, but the combined might of the human crowd hadn't been a force the rat creature could overcome. A good reminder of the lesson I learned with the yellow fur. There was a reason weak humans were at the apex of this world. Yes. I definitely have to remember this tactic. How brutally effective it was. And how quickly they turned on a monster. Escaping the hospital hadn't been difficult after the crowd killed the rat creature. The guards had managed to subdue a decent number of the ones they came across. And when Turbo arrived at the scene, he searched the hospital and ended the last few pockets of fighting in short order. Brillo was forced to move the van long before he came, due to some of the rat creatures trying to get at Gregor. So at the very least they weren't at the scene when the hero arrived. I, on the other hand, got stuck in the police debriefing afterwards. I answered some innocuous questions about events inside, and assured a harried EMT that I was fine before they left me alone. In the crowd of civilians and police, I gleaned whatever information I could from the questions police and medical personnel asked, as well as the chatter over their radios. 25 people missing. 2 critically injured and mutating. And 1 man dead after he tried to protect his young mutant daughter from a rat creature. The rat creatures had arrived using sewer tunnels around the hospital, and had broken a hole in the floor of the morgue to facilitate their escape with their cargo, a shame I couldn't follow. But Nicole would never have been able to reach the tunnels under the hospital in time to escort me. All things considered, it wasn't the worst outcome. No triggers had occurred. And the rat creatures hadn't been able to break into the Mutavis treatment ward because of the already higher than normal security. My biggest problem was that I needed to call a taxi in order to get to the mall and buy Cinnabons. The other minions couldn't risk staying with the hero around. So they had left after confirming I was fine. After a brief stop at the mall, I arrived at Mansionilst and paid the taxi driver. Then I climbed down the sewer entrance with my bag of Cinnabons, making sure to dodge Mr. Chonker's half-hearted lunge and bonk him once. Eventually he'd learn to stop. Then I was almost running around the bend to get to Nicole's. I was terribly late for our established meeting time. By a whole hour and 13 minutes. Up ahead I spotted Nicole. I had called her after I left the hospital and let her know that I was safe. She had been worried about still going on our outing after what had just happened. But I assured her that I wasn't at all tired from the ordeal. And, in fact, was more eager than ever to begin exploring the tunnels. Hey Nicole. Sorry I'm late. But I brought the Cinnabons. I made sure to get more than one like you asked. I handed the bag of Cinnabons to one of her smaller mandible claws. Several of her eyes blinked. You just got attacked by Frankenstein rat monsters and you're worried about Cinnabons. Are you sure you didn't get hit on the head? It was only a glancing blow. I'm fine, I assure you. Hey, are you joking? Yes. I heard mumbling coming from Nicole's den. It sounded like she was talking to herself. Humans did that sometimes. Although I hadn't quite figured out why. So are you ready to go, Nicole? One of her claws clacked. And she fell into silence. She was avoiding looking at me again. The silence stretched onwards. Is something wrong, Nicole? It's just well. I'm sorry the Cinnabons aren't warm. But they didn't have a container to keep the heat in. It's not the Cinnabons, she said. Then she let out a big sigh. It's just that I don't like people looking at me. Confusion. She hadn't seemed bothered by it up until now. Oh. Then have I offended you? What, no? 'Cause I've been looking at you when we talk. That's not what I meant. She yelled. I waited while she gathered her thoughts. Tofu. You're the only person I've met in years that doesn't look at me in terror. Well. That wasn't quite true. I was rather terrified when I first met her, but I decided to remain silent about that. I don't want that to change, she trailed off. Well. That wouldn't be a problem. While I didn't have complete control of my emotions, I did have complete and utter control of my facial expressions. If she needed for that to not happen, then I could do that. I promise that will never happen, Nicole. Her eyes finally focused back on me. But she didn't say anything. Do you want to call it off? I asked. I really hoped she didn't decide to call it off. And then she began to exit her den. The first segment of Nicole's body was her head. It was reminiscent of a scorpion's head, but heavily armored. And her 8 eyes were placed in a semicircle along the top half of her skull. The first 2 eyes faced forward, and were the most like a human's eyes. They had pupils. But the coloration was still uniformly dull gray to match her carapace. No visible iris. From there, a second pair was placed to either side of the first. This pair with no visible pupils. Next was a third pair that had strange pupils with an almost crosshair-like structure. And finally on either side of her head were the biggest pair, which were fully compound eyes. I recognized the compound structure from my research into insects and scorpions. All the eyes besides the large compound ones could blink and rotate independently in their sockets. I would have loved to know how her brain coordinated all the different visual inputs. I still had trouble with more than 4 eyes, let alone using differing designs. Mutavis had created a truly elegant design here. The bottom half of her face was taken up by her mouth. The top half was part of her skull like with a human's. But the lower mandible could split in 2, and was formed by a modified set of pedipalps. Both pedipalps were tipped by small, claw-like hands, composed of 3 fingers. Although stubby, I had seen her deftly manipulate a smartphone screen with those fingers, as well as rip a rat's head off with them when it came too close to her face. Oh! And her mouth could spit acid. An important detail. The second segment of her body was where her main claws were attached. Both claws were large and armored. And while not truly sharp, were easily strong enough to shear a medium-sized rat's body in half without effort. Together, the two claws were large enough to block half a sewer tunnel by themselves. It was almost like she was wielding two vault doors instead of claws. Impressive considering the rather thin arms they were attached to. Past her claws the segments became rather uniform. Each sported a pair of multi-jointed legs that stuck out from the sides and ended in a two-clawed foot. The joints themselves were odd, being a mishmash of human bone and arachnid exoskeleton, which resulted in a combination of ball-socket joints and reversible joints that could easily change direction. The resulting legs looked almost too thin to support her weight. But Mutavis had obviously found a way. As she practically glided out of her den, completely silent. Likely she'd be comfortable walking or crawling through a tunnel even if she had to do it upside down or backwards. All counted, there were 12 leg segments, which gave her 24 legs. And plenty of weight. And muscle. And leverage to easily handle her claw-heavy front end. I estimated that her total weight was actually around 25 tons. A bit higher than my previous estimate, although I would never tell her that. Humans apparently found it rude. And then came the tail. Here, Mutavis had outdone itself. I could see the perfection in its design. For about 20 feet past the last segment, extended a tail made from, if I was interpreting this right, braided cables of muscle. The outermost layer of muscles were like overlapping ribbons, and seemed to be made out of a flexible carapace composite. How? But when the tail flexed and coiled, I could see hints of the stronger cable muscles beneath. They likely extended all the way through her body, acting as an anchor for her muscular system in place of a spine. If I was right, this was how Nicole was strong enough to wield two giant claws like knives. And how such thin legs could support her weight. Mutavis had created some kind of hyper-strong, flexible muscle tissue. Envy. Compared to all that, Nicole's core unit was somewhat disappointing. It was attached to the end of her tail, and looked entirely like the upper half of a normal human. One head with the normal accompaniment of sensory organs, straight hair tied back in a ponytail. And two arms with one hand each, 5 fingers. I assumed the rest of her torso was also in order. But I couldn't see it since she was wearing a black t-shirt. As well as well-used heavy-duty overalls that ended in a many-pocketed skirt around her waist, filled with tools I noted. The only abnormalities were her tail that connected to her lower body somewhere under her skirt. And the fact that her pigmentation was uniformly dark gray to match the rest of her carapace. Even her eyes, nails, and hair. If it weren't for that she might have been any other young human woman. Her human torso didn't have any extra carapace. Or scales. Or claws. Or spines. Or anything else I could see. Too bad. But the parts that had mutated more than made up for that weakness. At least now I knew for certain why she always saved food for later. Her acid-spitting mouth probably didn't have taste buds. And that was one of the best parts about eating. Nicole had a duffel bag hanging over one shoulder. And she nervously fiddled with the tools in her skirt pockets despite the fact I could see they were all arranged neatly. She kept glancing at me and then back at her tools. Before finally saying, "Well." Confusion. Well, what? The tension drained out of her posture. If having her core unit exposed made her that nervous, I'd need to get her some armor. I knew I always felt better when my core was in my helmet. She made a nervous chuckle. And then smiled. Let's get going. The only guy who could have had to leave. Some situation up north. Pa. Bullshit. Just doesn't want to risk his own hide. Maybe. Or maybe there really was another emergency. Whole sectors only got 3 capes. They're stretched thin. Everyone does. But look on the bright side. We're getting paid double plus a bounty on each civi we rescue and rat we bag. Can't spend money if we're dead, said Blake. He spat another loogie down the hole and frowned when he couldn't hear a splat. We're also authorized to use the big guns. Blake turned away from his staring contest with the abyss and raised a questioning brow at Abe. For real? Yup. Guess the sector mayor or some other bigwig wants this shit dealt with. They even offered to restock all the ammo we use. Well shit, Abe. Why didn't you just say so let's bag us some rats? The 2 men turned away from the hole in the floor of the morgue and headed for one of the loading docks where the hospital received deliveries. 2 vans and a large semi-truck were rolling in. All of them with the company's logo emblazoned across their side, the silhouette of a vampire, with a red circle and /no symbol covering it. The vans unloaded 6 people each, and including the drivers and support crew. That brought the group assembled here to 20 people. Abe and Blake had started as a small 2-man squad after leaving the service. And they had slowly grown their company into one of the better respected, expensive, extermination crews in the city. Despite their small size. Vampires. Banshees. Illegal pets that had triggered and grown to monstrous size. You name it, they had hunted it. Frankenstein rats was a new one for them though. So they had called everyone in. Yo boss. What's the big hullabaloo? I thought we were hunting vampires, said one of the new arrivals. New plan, said Abe. Some asshole has been making Frankenstein monsters out of rats. Kidnapped a bunch of people and then fled into the sewer. We're being paid for each civi we get back and each monster we put down. There were surprised stares and worried murmurs at that. Rescuing kidnapped victims from a villain, that was a job for heroes. Or maybe the police. Calm your tits, growled Blake, with a sly grin on his face. We get to break out the bolters. For real. And the clients picking up the ammo tab. At that proclamation there were some cheers. They got to use the bolters, then the job was as good as done. They just needed to save a few civis from overgrown rat monsters and collect their check at the end. Probably get a damn medal for it too. Please and thank you. The back of the semi-truck was opened up, and reinforced cases full of equipment were pulled out, including the 2 large crates with the warning labels, not because of the contents, but because if you touched them without permission Blake would rip you a new one. The hunters that opened them did so almost reverently, revealing the contents that were sacred to anyone who had ever been on the wrong end of too many claws and fangs. Kruger 370 automatic. Smooth lock. Portable handheld heavy bolters. Delivered straight to our unworthy hands from heaven's very own gun assembly line. Also known as New Dawn Inc.'s Factory No. 7. There were 4 bolters total. Not enough for everyone who'd be going down into the tunnels, but enough to ventilate anything that challenged the group 4 times over. The portable version of heavy bolters could only use lightning rounds. But that was all you really needed. Designed to penetrate armor and lodge in flesh. The rounds were charged by the gun, and would discharge their payload to burn deep. A necessity when the vast majority of triggered animals wound up with regeneration as a power. The guns also had a stun setting. But who the hell ever used that? The only problem with them was the possibility of stray rounds, which put bolters under even heavier restrictions than normal weaponry. A single round wouldn't always kill unless it hit the right spot, but it would put them down. New Dawn Inc. Guarantee. And the mutations that occurred due to a lightning round wound, well, they tended to be nasty. Alright, gather round you punks. yelled Blake. As people finished gearing up. Time to see what you're working with. Abe waited for the group to assemble. And then pulled the tarp off a pile in the dock to reveal the body of one of the Stitch creatures that had assaulted the hospital. Several people recoiled at the sight of it. And expletives were used liberally. Yeah. It's big and ugly. But that's about it. No special abilities or powers to worry about. And they're none too bright either. Most of the ones they put down were beaten to death by hospital guards. So a few bullets or a bolt will put them down right quick. One of the head doctors did a look over. And it's likely that the super responsible is a puppeteer. Not a tinker. So all we gotta do is pop them and the whole circus goes with them. Oh. And remember to check your lines of fire. All the kidnap victims were mutants. Even if they don't have armbands, check first. I don't need to lose a several $1,000 bonus because y'all were trigger happy. The group set about making final preparations for the rescue mission. There were communications to set up. And they needed to make sure the hole was a viable access point. Some of the hunters were already done gearing up. And were gathered around the corpse. Partly to discuss tactics to use against other Stitch creatures. But mostly just to prod at it and talk shit. So the poor blokes got stapled to a rat. Ain't that the shit? Man. Have some respect. How many of them do you think there are? Don't really matter. Tight corridors. For bolters there could be 100 and we'd be fine. One of the newer hunters. A guy named Titus. Nervously toed the corpse with his boot. Are all of these parts mutant? Some of it looks off. Besides the rat I mean. Might be some alligator mixed in. It is a sewer after all. Said an older member of the group. Some of the group members chuckled. Hey. I'm not kidding. There was that one guy with the green ooze downtown. They caught him dumping gator babies and turtles and shit into a sewer with the stuff. Took a week to hunt it all down. So you've been in the tunnels before? Asked Titus. I have indeed. Said the veteran hunter. Once back in S3 with the aforementioned gator babies. Another time in N6 with a rogue vampire. What are the tunnels like? I've heard stories. Bah. Course you have. I just told you about the gator babies. Mostly they're just smelly. Trust me kid. We might run into some vampires or a gator or whatever. But that's what we got the bolters for. Besides these ugly beasties. He kicked the corpse. The worst we'll see is some big rats. Nicole. Stay close. The rats are the least of our worries down here, not that close. She shoved Tofu to the side. And then immediately remembered that wasn't exactly socially appropriate. He hadn't actually been too close. But her personal bubble had grown over the last 3 years since she mutated. And her social skills were pretty rusty. Luckily. Tofu remained unfazed as ever. And ignored her social faux pas. I've been meaning to ask about that. Said Tofu. Everyone keeps telling me that the tunnels are dangerous. But the only dangerous thing I've encountered are rats. That's because you've spent most of your time in the sewers. They're the safest part. The section between us and the surface is dangerous because that's where all the understructure for the city is. And below us is dangerous because that's where all the organic life hides. That's where the rats come from. No. They're scavengers. They nest near the surface so they can raid it for garbage. They're basically the bottom of the food chain down here. The only thing lower is the Nessies. Ah. Can you tell me more about some of the animals we could encounter? Oh sure. Let's see, there's crickets. Spiders. Cheepers. Sligs. Crocs. One time I actually found an octopus. Will-o-wisps. Those you really need to be careful for. As well as vampires. Gru. Click slithers. Hunters. Holy shit, that is a big rat. Understatement of the goddamn year. Thank God for bolters. The hunters were gathered around the corpse of an absolutely massive rat they had just downed. It was large and white and just about the size of a tank. With incisors like swords. It had damn near cracked the ceiling with its head when they loaded it with lightning rounds. I don't see any stitch marks, said one of the hunters. Think this is a Frankenstein special. Gotta be. I've seen big-ass pack rats before. But that's just ridiculo, look out. The hunter who cried the warning suddenly pulled the man next to him aside. Sticking out of the water where the man had been standing was the head of a snake that could have given Tholu a run for its money. Tentacles lining a razor maw of teeth. The hunter's gun came up. And he fired a burst into the thing's face. The thing squealed and started thrashing. And suddenly it became apparent that the snake was attached to a larger body in the water. Blake came forward with one of the bolters. And sank some lightning rounds into the thing to finish it off. Only when it finally died did they dare to drag it out of the water. You let that suck your. Shut it. Both of you. Said Blake. We've wasted enough time as it is. Let's get moving. They formed up and continued on. With Blake taking point and keeping a watchful eye on the pace. The dark and the risk of ambush was getting to some of the hunters. Mostly the newbies. But Abe didn't like it either. Admittedly, he had expected an easier trail to follow. But apparently the super responsible for the monsters saw fit to let them operate autonomously. There weren't any lights or equipment that might have indicated the attack on the hospital was planned from close by. The monsters were just dragging their victims through the sewer however far it took to get to their destination. He gave one last look at the weird snake/croc monster that had tried to ambush them. At least they were going in the right direction. Tofu. 1 SEC. Just need to wrench this lever and stop the flow for a bit. Said Nicole. The lever in question was attached to the water main that serviced Manchineal St. and the surrounding blocks. Technically it was an emergency shut-off valve. But Nicole had jury-rigged it to be an on-off switch. With the water stopped she could make small improvements to the pipes before turning it on again. We were trying to add a small spout to the pipe that would shoot water down a side tunnel. And make a current for the Nessies. Nicole grabbed the lever with her human hands and pulled. The lever must have been stuck. Because she had to strain to get it to move. Which caused the muscles in her forearms to stand out. That was when I saw another little mutavis improvement, when the muscles in her arms strained. They bunched up. Coiling around themselves and creating squiggly patterns under her skin. Seems her human half was not as unmodified as I thought. Mutavis had changed the muscles internally to provide strength while leaving her appearance of a younger woman unchanged. A clever deception. I wondered how many enemies had targeted her core only to find it was not as vulnerable as it seemed. Unfortunately. She noticed I was watching and her hand slipped. The recoil nearly bashed her head against the wall. Are you all right? I'm fine. Just. Keep a lookout or something, yeah. Sure. I'd noticed similar behavior several times. Normally associated with any indication I was paying too much attention to her. At first I thought it fear that her vulnerable core was being analyzed for weakness. But this seemed to be a more human, psychological problem. She was afraid that I would be afraid of her. Which frankly made no sense to me. Perhaps some malfunction of her emotions I could empathize. Once Nicole had the water shut off. I carved a hole in the pipe. The remaining water shot out under pressure. But eventually lessened enough to allow me to stick the sawed-off pipe piece into the hole. And aim it in the direction Nicole needed. Then I took a tube of sealant and made sure the pipe piece was cemented in place. Using my fingers to make sure the sealant reached all the right places. Technically you weren't supposed to touch the stuff directly, since it would fuse your fingers together. But that wasn't a problem for me. Once I was done, Nicole turned the water back on. And a stream of water shot out of the newly made spigot. It flew down the tunnel and into the canal flowing down the center. I didn't notice a big change in the water flow. But Nicole assured me she had it mapped out. It only needs a little bit in a few different places. And the city won't send someone to fix it. Not if I'm planning this right. Maybe if we were closer to Central they'd catch it. But it's a bit more lax out here. I'd think they would want to keep a better eye on the areas near the wall. You'd think. But tons of stuff slips through the cracks. Interesting. It definitely gets that way sometimes. Just remember to not go any deeper than the sewers. Don't touch anything that looks like a gizmo if you don't know what you're doing. Oh. And don't follow any lights. Hunters. They'd run into another of the snake things. As well as a few normal, but still large, rats when they explored a tunnel that had been dug into the side of the sewer. They had been starting to worry that they'd lost the trail when they found the tunnel, which led to an older maintenance shaft that was a floor lower than the sewer. The lights no longer worked. But there were pipes all over the walls that they could follow. Lights up ahead. Called out a hunter in front. Something was sparking in the darkness of the tunnel, looking a bit like a downed power line. They approached the source, which turned out to indeed be a downed power line. It was wrapped around a metal pipe that it was sparking against. Unfortunately, it meant that they couldn't continue forward following the pipes. The tunnel was too narrow. And they didn't want to accidentally electrocute themselves somehow. There was more than one wire hanging down from the ceiling. Turn it around. We'll have to try and find a side tunnel to bypass this one. The troop of hunters about faced. But as luck would have it, another thick cable fell from the ceiling right in the middle of the group. It slammed into the side of one man's shoulder, knocking him to the floor. Holy shit. Jeffrey. Jeffrey, are you alright? Someone get the medkit. I'm fine. I'm fine. It wasn't live, said Jeffrey. Jesus, don't scare us like that, man, said the man who had yelled. He reached down to help Jeffrey up, when the cable that had smacked Jeffrey suddenly twitched and slammed Jeffrey's would-be helper in the face, knocking him back. Fuck. The Ellie tink, my nose is broken, said the man, clutching his bloody nose. Several hunters aimed their guns up to shine light at the offending cable. And up. And up. Those weren't cables. The one that had smacked the hunters was attached to some kind of rock-looking thing. And there was more than one of them. As they watched, the cable slowly drew back up into it. Maybe we should. And swiftly flew back out, attempting to slam into Jeffrey again. One hunter fired his gun at the offending rock thing. He really shouldn't have. Nicole. Ooh. Stand back, Tofu. They pack a mean punch. The creatures in question were attached to a wall, and had lashed out at Nicole when her arachnid half moved past and disturbed them. Her large claw took the hits without problem, and she began to scrape them off the wall with the other while they continued to pummel her. What are they? Asked Tofu. Barnacles. Well, technically I think they're some kind of clam, answered Nicole. I love these things, but they're kinda rare. They eat whatever they can catch. Mostly rats. But they can't move. They tend to starve after the rats figure out to avoid them. That seems like a bad survival tactic. Hey. I won't complain. These things are delicious even if you eat them raw. Nicole's brain caught up to what she just said. Tofu already knew she couldn't taste with her arachnid mouth. They'd talked about it when they had snacked on the Cinnabons earlier. She'd basically just admitted to eating raw sewer clams. Sure. That had been well before she'd finished mutating. And it had been necessary. But still. So embarrassing. Can I try one? Huh. Tofu had of course completely ignored Nicole's embarrassment. And had approached the pile of dying clams. Can I have one? I've never tried these before. If you want, I have a hot plate with me, we could cook them on. No need. Tofu grabbed one of the ones that were no longer struggling. And quickly wrenched the shell open. Then he grabbed a handful of the meat and tore it out. Before taking a big old bite and eating it. He chewed. He swallowed. You're right, Nicole. These are good. Do you mind if I eat a few more? No. Go ahead, but pass me one. No way am I going to be the squeamish one. Hunters. Calm it down, Henrik. They're dead now, said Abe. The ceiling of the tunnel they were in had come alive with those tongue things. The bolters had killed them readily enough. But they had needed to make a run for it. The group was banged up. But other than Leibowitz's broken nose, the only real injury was their pride. Theo is missing. What? I don't see Donald either. Did anyone see them get snatched? A head count was performed. And it turned out that a good third of the group hadn't come out. No one had seen anyone get snatched. And the bolters had torn up the ceiling with the snatchers something fierce. So it was unlikely that anyone got killed. Blake was also missing. And Abe didn't believe for a second that those tongue monsters had managed to put a tough bastard like Blake down. More than likely they had gone down the wrong side passage in their flight from the tunnel. Which was the reason the group hadn't split up to track the kidnap victims from the get-go. E13's sewer was like Swiss cheese, the blueprints they had brought with them were almost completely useless. Alright, here's the deal. We're gonna do some light recon in the surrounding tunnels. If we run into Blake's group, we'll continue on. Otherwise we're heading back topside. Standard procedure. The group picked itself up. And backtracked a bit before heading down the first side tunnel they could find. Hopefully they'd run into Blake's group. And this little snafu would be just another funny story. Nicole. This side tunnel leads to a storm drain, said Nicole. How can you tell? Asked Tofu. When it rains, this one always leaks, she replied. Tofu took a picture with his phone while Nicole stifled a giggle. I feel like a tour guide. They continued down the rocky pathway they had been following. This path wasn't part of the sewers. It was a fracture in the cement structure below the subway system that the city had somehow never found. Nicole had cleared out the spiders. And used it to bypass the subway system whenever she went north. What is this pipe for? Asked Tofu. Pointing at a large rectangular pipe that spanned the crevice higher up. That, believe it or not, is one of the secret entrances to Helion's lair. Ah. One of the elevators. Ah. I expected more of a reaction than that. Wait. How'd you know she uses elevators? There's rumors. Tim talks about hero stuff a lot. Ever think about becoming a hero? Your power is perfect for it. Definitely not. Way too dangerous. I work in a warehouse. Ftahahaha. What's so funny? Nothing, Tofu. Nothing. Heh. Too dangerous. As if he wasn't in the tunnels trying to rescue people. Seriously, Tofu. Learn to lie better. Hunters. Blake had had better days. The good news was that he'd found one of the stitch creatures. Had the stitches and everything. Hisses. The bad news was he'd lost his goddamn bolter. Arg. The rat creature bent. And bit his arm. He used his other hand to stab his thumb into its eye, forcing it to let go. Blake had been with a few other hunters who had gotten lost after the tongue monster incident. They'd been ambushed by a pack of stitch creatures from the side. And unfortunately Blake had been knocked into the smelly canal running down the middle. The rat creature in front of him had fallen in with him. And the two had been swept away as they struggled to kill each other. That's when he lost his bolter. He kept his fists up. Trying to close in on the thing was proving to be difficult. It had claws on its hands that were sharp enough to cut. Let alone the teeth. When he got out of this, he was buying one of those hoity-toity waterproof pistols Donald was always going on about. He waited for openings in the rat creature's guard. And swung when he could do so without opening up his own defense. The biggest problem was the footing. They were both standing in ankle-deep water. And soaked boots did not outmatch clawed feet when it came to wet and slippery cement. Even the minor current threatened to drag him off his feet with one careless boot placement. He could do this though. The creature sucked at fisticuffs. Unused to fighting with its own mutilated body. He kept pounding at it. And it looked like it would run out of steam before he did. He wound up to deal a heavy blow at its exposed chin and then leaped instead, dodging the thing's whip-like tail that had been sneaking under the water. He cleared the tail. And managed to weakly punch the creature's face besides. But he landed too heavily on the slippery floor, breaking his stance. The creature kicked forward. Shockingly fast, it had been playing possum. And hit home on Blake's exposed knee, shattering it. "Arg!" screamed Blake, falling sideways into the filthy water. He resisted the urge to clutch at his broken knee, and tried to scoot himself back as fast as possible with his hands and one good leg. An almost impossible task given the slippery surface. The rat creature advanced on him, taking its time. It knew it had him. Seems they weren't all quite as dull as they appeared. The rat thing reached him and raised a clawed foot. It was going to break his other leg. It didn't need to. It had him dead to rights anyway. But it seemed whatever malevolent intelligence remained behind those black eyes wanted to toy with him. Blake braced for the blow. Bam bam bam. And flinched at the sound of semi-automatic fire echoing through the dark tunnel. The rat thing he had been fighting fell backwards into the water, sporting some new holes. "Shit, that was close. Are you alright?" Titus, thank God," said Blake, nearly flopping deeper into the water in his relief. "God damn, that was lucky. Didn't think I'd catch up." Titus grabbed Blake's hand. But when they tried to haul him up, Blake screamed and he fell. The broken knee was too much. Another one of the hunters caught up. And together he and Titus finally managed to get Blake to the walkway, where they began the painful process of setting the leg with a splint. "What happened to Arg? The others? Did they make it?" asked Blake. "Heh. That's 'cause they're smart," chuckled Blake darkly. "Not that I don't appreciate the rescue. But..." Blake heaved himself to 1 foot with the help of the 2 other hunters. Tofu. This place was great. There was so much food to eat. Nicole and I had run into multiple organisms in the darkness of the tunnels just under the sewers. Cheapers. Which turned out to be small little swarmas that looked like fanged mouths with small legs. They couldn't jump at all. And eating them was as simple as picking them up and chowing down as the others uselessly gnawed at your legs, exoskeletal modifications required. A slig. Which turned out to be a giant slug that spat acid. Nicole's acid was better. And melted its face off. And was especially delicious once cooked on Nicole's hot plate. Almost like bacon. But thicker. A grue. Which was a terribly misshapen humanoid with far more teeth than was beneficial. How the thing managed to eat with its mouth jammed with teeth I didn't know. But even with its bent and malformed limbs it was admittedly strong enough that Nicole had to beat it against the floor a few times to kill it. That one didn't taste good at all, bony, bitter, and gamey. And Nicole had to melt most of it down before she could eat the rest. I was starting to see how so many animals hadn't been causing more problems for the sector. Nicole was the apex predator of the sewers. And probably consumed several tons a week in order to keep up with her metabolism. It was almost tempting to try this lifestyle myself. But Nicole soon demonstrated why that was a bad idea. We were walking past a tunnel when some lights caught my attention. They were soft and blue in color, lightly floating above the water. "Hey Nicole. What's that?" She gasped and froze. I took her cue and froze as well. After a few seconds went by, she whispered, "Tofu." Very slowly. And very quietly. "Keep walking. Don't step in the water." I had been on the walkway when I noticed the lights. But I took a cautious few steps away from the water before continuing on. Several tunnel intersections went by before she felt it was safe to talk. "That was a will-o-wisp," she said. "They're blind. But they use those lights to attract prey. Last time I ran into one I almost died. I barely got away." "What do they look like?" "Basically a subway train with teeth. They dig a burrow in the rock when they're small. And extend it as they grow. Then they basically just sit and wait until they sense things move by. And they're brutal when they attack. I haven't found a way to kill them yet, so far poison and electricity haven't worked. And they don't seem to starve if you keep prey away from the area." She reached into her duffel and pulled out a map. Then used a pen to mark the tunnel where the will-o-wisp was. "And that's another tunnel I can't use. Shit." I considered the problem presented by the will-o-wisp. Something didn't make sense to me. Why does the city allow those to exist? Shouldn't a hero have cleared them out by now? They probably don't know it exists yet. Will-o-wisps didn't exist 4 months ago. Did someone make them? Maybe. Why haven't you reported them yet? She stopped talking suddenly. And turned away from me. Her hands were clenched at her sides. And every now and then a claw clacked. "And I'd appreciate if you not tell anyone." "Tofu. I'd rather not have to move again." "I won't tell anyone, Nicole. I promise." "Thank you. I'm sorry for yelling." "It's fine, Nicole. I understand. If anyone had stolen that much food from me, I'd be pissed too." Hunters. Abe was lost. Completely and utterly lost. Cheap. He swung his bolter around, desperately trying to see where the sound came from. Was it behind him? To the side? The goddamn tunnels echoed so goddamn much. Cheap. Cheap. Ha. He ran, swinging the sight light on his bolter to have any hope of where he was going. He should have never taken this job. He should have known better than to take on a villain. And this one was goddamn sadistic. He was an experienced monster hunter. Shoot a few monsters. Bag one villain. Rescue a bunch of grateful victims. It had seemed so simple. But down in the dark tunnels, with horrors around every corner, suddenly the logic for why he came down here seemed fuzzy. He slowed down. Then dropped to his knees in exhaustion. Breathing heavily. His heart was playing the drums in his ears. And he desperately tried to calm down so that he could listen for any hints of cheeping. And that's why backwards knees are better than forward bending knees for combat. What, digitigrade tofu? It's digitigrade. What's that, people? Some of his team must have made it. Either that or he was hallucinating. But he'd take anyone right now. He forced himself to his feet. and started searching to find which tunnel the voices were coming from. It's not a backwards knee. Lots of animals walk on their toes. What you're seeing is technically the heel. Not a backwards knee. No. I'm pretty sure I'm using the knee. See, snap, pop. Yo. Don't do that. You do it too. Mine don't pop like that. He was getting closer. He began jogging for the intersection ahead where he heard the voices the loudest. Then he announced his presence before he went around the corner. No use taking a bullet from a startled team member after making it though all this. Hello, it's me, Abe. Don't shoot. It wasn't a team member. It was big. He aimed his light up. Claws. Carapace. Those eyes. Cold and deadly. No hint of humanity. The eyes of a true predator. Like a shark's. He laughed. He raised the bolter. Is he dead? Oh my God. Is he dead? Calm down, Nicole. His heart is beating. I think you just knocked him out. The stupid man had come around the corner and almost immediately opened fire on Nicole. Her claw blocked the bolts. But in her surprise she had whacked the man rather hard, sending him flying. And breaking his gun. I was surprised at her concern for a man that had tried to kill her. But she claimed that this kind of thing was somewhat normal. And probably an accident. Humans were so weird about killing each other. It was his fault if he died here. But Nicole was nearly beside herself with worry. Okay. Okay. There should be a manhole cover just around the corner. You can carry him up and then the hospital is only a few blocks away. They should have the place running again by now. I sighed quietly. Annoying. Guess this meant my tunnel exploration was over for now. And we had finally made it to the area around the hospital too. I slung the man over a shoulder. Before letting Nicole lead me to the manhole cover. Thanks for escorting me today, Nicole. Sure. Sure. Anytime. Just get going, getting knocked unconscious isn't good for people. Oh geez. I hope he doesn't mutate. I'd feel so bad. No worries, Nicole. His heartbeat really is steady. I'll take care of him. I climbed up the ladder with the man over my shoulder. So troublesome. I couldn't have him reporting any monsters and causing problems for Nicole. Maybe I could blame any organism he saw on the Stitch Rat creator. More importantly though, I had some questions for him. I recognized lightning rounds. As well as the label on the gun. I needed to know what this was about. TCH. Figures. A sewer system full of predators and the most dangerous thing I find is a stupid human. Mr. Chonkers. That was his name. And he kinda. Sorta. But not really. Recognized it when the apex spoke it to him. The vibrations that made up his name were often followed up with small morsels of tasty rat meat. So Mr. Chonkers did his very best to memorize the sound. It was only natural that he was smart enough to recognize the sounds of the apex. As he was the alpha of his troop of Nessies, another sound he recognized. He was just that good. Once upon a time, Mr. Chonkers had been small. Hiding from one shallow pool to another. Scraping the barest scraps of algae from the wet stones. Now he was the biggest of his troop of Nessies. Which was the largest troop of Nessies for miles around. Which by right of might made him alpha of alphas. When he flipped his tail flukes the females crooned. When he bit other males they squealed. None could deny that of Nessies he was the greatest example. Technically this meant he was apex. And he was in the eyes of his troop. But being the wise Nessie that he was. He knew that that title belonged to the many-legged one. Destroyer of the hated rats. Killer of the darkest beasts. bringer of meats. The many-legged one was the true apex. And it was in her lair that the troop sheltered. While the troop rested in her protection, the rats dared not attack. And all fanged ones had been turned aside. Truly this was a paradise. Many ages ago, 5 months. Mr. Chonkers had realized that the many-legged one did not kill the Nessies, after 2 months of being bonked. And that she did not care for the scraps of her domain. He had led his troop to her tunnel. And there they had thrived. Growing fat and strong. And able to push other rival troops from the prime scraping spots. Life had been good. But then the corrupted ones came. They smelled of rat. But they were not rat. They had many arms and legs and claws. And they hunted his kind without mercy. There was once a balance between Nessie and rat. But these newer, corrupted rats hunted everything. Even the normal rats. And all the beings of the tunnels shunned them. Many an alpha had met its end defending its troop from the corrupted ones. And Mr. Chonker's troop had grown large from absorbing the females and beta males that survived. At first it had been pretty great. But now it was getting kind of crowded. Vibrations. Movement. It was coming. Another new change. Around the same time the corrupted ones appeared. Had come the false one. Always hanging around the apex. And distracting her from giving Mr. Chonker's treats. It looked like prey but was predator. Its flesh was fresh and alive. But also a carrion shell. It tried to hide what it was. But Mr. Chonkers could tell. While blind. He could smell a patch of filmy sludge from 10 tunnels away. Let alone a corpse. Or the delicious odor that came from the false one's sugar-rich, chemical-tainted meat shell. Mr. Chonkers waited for the false one's vibrations to draw close and then lunged at the false one. And was bonked for his efforts. So stingy. So mean. It would never woo the attentions of a female as large as the apex by being so selfish. Speaking of which, Mr. Chonkers slipped through the water. And then bit a beta male on the flank. Causing it to squeal. A just punishment for getting too close to Mr. Chonkers' favorite female. Know your place. Admittedly, it was hard for the beta males to put distance between themselves and his harem with so little room. But that was their problem. Mr. Chonkers blew some bubbles in a show of dominance. Then began searching the edges of the lair for any algae or sludge that might have turned up. It really was becoming a problem how crowded it was. Maybe the apex was feeling generous. He swam back to the center of the apex's lair. But failed to feel any vibrations that would indicate the apex was about to hand out tasty morsels. In fact, she was gone. The false one as well. He had been too distracted. And had missed their departure. Stupid beta male. Stupid hungry tummy. Without the apex they were all doomed. Doomed to be hunted by things with sharp teeth and no manners. Doomed to wallow. Oh hey wait. What was that smell? Mr. Chonkers and several other Nessies all smelled it. The current had changed. And they could now detect several new patches of slime. As well as half a dead rat just beyond the boundaries of the apex's domain. There was a mad dash for the new food sources. But Mr. Chonkers bit many flanks. And slapped his tail in many faces to get to the rat corpse first. It was a tiny morsel. Only half a pound of rat. But to a Nessie it was a feast. He promptly ate half. Before giving the other half to a new female that had only joined the troop 2 days ago. Because Mr. Chonkers was a gentlenessie who knew how to woo the lassies, unlike a stingy fake he knew. Mr. Chonkers observed the other Nessies as they set about scouring the patches of slime and algae. Then he tried to think about why there was suddenly more food. The apex had left. The current had shifted. They were all doomed. There was more food. The false one also left. Rats were tasty but mean. The apex left. They were all doomed. Had he thought that already, he put all of his brain power to work on trying to connect the dots. So many new things had happened. Far too much for one being to put together. Even if he was so smart and amazing. But he knew that his troop was counting on the brilliant him to lead them to safety. So he didn't give up. He kept thinking with all his might, and who the hell was making a mating call in his troop? He was the alpha, damn it. He head arched back and forth on his long neck. The tentacles lining his mouth wriggling as he tried to detect the exact source of the vibration that signaled a male was ready to mate. He was going to bite their flank so hard. The signal kept coming. Louder and louder. How big was this male? Until it started to overwhelm him. It thrummed. It beat. It pulsed. Wait. This wasn't a mating call, it was coming from inside his own head. The vibration pulsed from deep in his head. Out of his mouth. And then out into the world. Then the echo returned. Giving him a crystal clear imprint of the world around him. Nessies were good at sensing vibration. But this was at a whole other level. He was a genius. Another pulse. And then another. Each echo bigger than the last. And each one giving him a more perfect picture of the world around him. First the tunnels around the apex's lair. Then the tunnels throughout the sector. Then the entire city and beyond. He sensed it all. He knew that a large metal thing would have a delay because a meat walker would stick its foot in the metal thing's mouth for too long. He knew that the traveler stalked the walls of the fortress, seeking entry. He saw the little things that permeated the meat walkers, trying to save the meat from everything. He knew things that would happen tomorrow. Or 1,000 years ago. For what was time but motion? The measure of change between moments. Falling rocks that hit one after the other. Transferring a wave of kinetic energy that had echoed since the everything began. The secrets of the everything were all his to peruse. He sensed it all and he knew it all. Which was why he bit the male sitting next to him on the flank. The beta was going to try and woo a female Mr. Chonkers would meet a week from now. Know your place. The confused male squeaked in submission and swam away. As was proper. Mr. Chonkers then turned back to doing. What had he been doing again? Oh right. He had to move the troop to a new den. This one wouldn't be safe much longer. Sir. Ugh. Sir, I'm going to have to insist that you wake up. Abe's head was pounding. He felt like he'd just gotten hit by a train. He tried to open his eyes. But the bright light suddenly attacking his retinas had him clutching his head in pain. Are you alright, sir, and what are you doing back here? If this is odd summer related, I'm afraid I'll need some kind of answer from you. Ugh. Sorry. Head hurts. Abe mumbled. And tried again to open his eyes. From what he could make out, he was in some random alleyway. He didn't recognize it. Understandable. But considering you had an illegal weapon on you, I'm going to have to insist that you work through it and start giving me answers. Abe finally managed to look past the blur of sunlight and see who he was talking to. It was a cop. And he had his gun drawn and aiming at Abe from a good distance away. The sudden sight of a weapon trained on him kickstarted his brain. I am an exterminator. Abraham Cunningham. License number 446. F6F. 6D6. 564. I have a permit for the bolter. It came back to him in a rush. The dark tunnels. The ambush. The run-in with various horrors. Those eyes. He suddenly sat up. Then clutched his head and yelled in pain at the sudden movement. Luckily the cop had steady nerves. Or he might have gotten shot. He sputtered as he tried to get words out. "My team. We were, ugh. Whoa there. Take it easy," replied the cop. "I'll check your badge number and you just take your time. No rush." The cop gingerly removed his phone and started punching numbers. Not putting away the gun but lowering the aim so it wasn't pointed at Abe. Couldn't blame the cop for being careful, if you thought getting called in for monsters was bad. Try dealing with a domestic dispute during odd summer. Abe didn't envy his job. Although some days the monsters were definitely worse. "All right. Looks like it checks out," said the cop, holstering his weapon. "Think you're up for telling me what happened? This have something to do with what happened at the hospital?" "Yes. My team and I were hired to try and track the creatures responsible. We were told the villain who made them was a puppeteer. Our intel must have been faulty. The sewers were damn near crawling with life. My team, I doubt any of them made it." Abe's thoughts spiraled at that. You lost people in this business sometimes. But this was an unmitigated disaster. If he hadn't had the bolter he would be dead as well. Speaking of which. Where's my bolter? I had it on me. Did the cop take it? Abe didn't see it on him. He tried to get to his feet. But stumbled. Did he have a concussion? It felt like a concussion. Before that. You said there's stuff in the sewers, asked the cop, offering him a hand up. A puppeteer you said. I don't think it's a puppeteer. I think it's a tinker, replied Abe. It must have been a concussion. His head felt so foggy. His brain seemed to be having trouble putting one thought in front of the other. There were so many varieties. And the ones who attacked the hospital were different. Those all had stitches. It might be more than one super. I'd bet money on at least one tinker. Some of those things. They were breeding down there. Well. I'll call it in and hopefully they can get a hero on it pronto, said the cop. Does this sector have a hero who can handle large-scale infestations? My team wouldn't be able to handle that many even if we were. Even if we were at full strength. I'm sure we can find someone to handle it. Are you not hearing me? Yelled Abe, grabbing the front of the cop's shirt. It felt waxy. Almost like plastic. Or maybe cheap synthetic silk. There is a major infestation in this sector. Screw calling in a hero. This sector should be in lockdown and the sewers purged. If those things get out into the city at large we could be facing a disaster. Can you let go of my shirt please sir, said the cop. Abe realized what he was doing and released the cop. Outburst over. He wavered unsteadily and the cop had to help keep him from falling back to the ground. Either way. I think the first thing is to get you medical attention, said the cop, slowly getting one of Abe's arms over his shoulder and supporting him so he could walk. No worries. I'll report this monster business into my superiors and they'll handle it from there. You on the other hand need to get to a hospital. Come on. It's right around the corner. Right. All right. They started heading down the alleyway, which was between tall buildings and sheltered from the main roads surrounding the block. How did Abe even get here? The last thing he remembered was the thing with the eyes in the sewer. He'd tried to shoot it. And the next thing he knew he was miraculously above ground. If a bit worse for wear. Wait. My bolter, said Abe, suddenly remembering. Damn this concussion. He couldn't leave the bolter. His company had only had the 4 of them. And after today it seemed unlikely they'd be able to replace the ones they did lose. Bolters and similar tools were vital for people in his profession. But the tinker-made weapons didn't come cheap. And without them the company might collapse. And what's left of my team shouldn't lose their jobs on top of everything else. "It's over here," said the cop. The bolter had been placed on the lid of a random trash can against the wall of the alley. It seemed almost sacrilegious to see the high-tech weapon lying among the common garbage of the day. You'd think he'd put it somewhere better than a random trash can. Couldn't his partner have held on to it? Wait a minute. Where was the cop's partner? Cops did not work alone as a rule. And during odd summer you never saw them alone. How had he gotten out of the sewer? Where was the cop's partner? Something in Abe's addled brain finally clicked. This wasn't a cop. The cop's uniform. His phone. His gun. None of them had been quite right. None of them standard issue. He could feel his adrenaline start to flow. But he didn't take any action that would show his hand. His bolter. Once he had that he'd be fine. It didn't look like the fake cop was going to stop him from retrieving it. "Damn. What gave me away?" asked the cop. Abe didn't wait a second. His hand moved to grab the fake cop's gun, definitely not a standard police taser gun. And then he shoved the cop while pulling the gun from the holster. Adrenaline and nerves and training temporarily making up for the concussion. The gun dissolved in his hands. 1 second it was a hefty 8-cylinder revolver that looked a bit like a police gun. The next second it might as well have been sand for how it crumbled. Abe turned and lunged for the bolter. His opponent was a super. The bolter was his only hope. He grabbed the bolter. Turned. Aimed. Fired. The bolter let out a whine and then exploded, taking most of Abe's right hand with it. AF. Yeah. I should have mentioned it was broken. Yes. It's pretty bad. Not enough to trigger Mutavis though. Unless we let you bleed out. Come on. The hospital is close by and you really do need medical help now. Maybe if you restrain your unnecessary outbursts and think a bit more we can actually improve your situation. The fake cop casually walked over to Abe and offered him a hand up. Then thought better of it since Abe was using his only uninjured hand to staunch the bleeding. Abe flinched when the man put a hand on his shoulder. But when it became apparent the cop was only helping him up, Abe let him. At this point his addled mind was barely keeping up. The cop wasn't a cop. But he was helping him. Confusion and pain were the only things going through Abe's distracted mind. And if the cop wasn't actually out to get him, then Abe wouldn't question it. Instead he tried to just concentrate on staying standing. Which made it quite simple for the cop to stab a knife into the base of Abe's skull and up into his brain, killing him instantly. Such a waste. I tried to do as Nicole wanted. But in the end the human just proved too stupid to save. At some point after I tried to help him to the hospital, he figured out I wasn't a real police officer. And since I was helping him walk I was close enough to smell the flood of adrenaline when he realized I wasn't who I said I was. I wonder what gave me away. Admittedly there were several flaws in my disguise. But it was the best idea I could think of to get willing answers out of him. The only thing better would have been a hero. But that would have made it impossible to avoid notice. And I would have been under far harsher scrutiny if I tried to bring the exterminator to the hospital. The police disguise was my attempt to get answers and remain undiscovered long enough to leave him with medical help. So much for that plan. In the end what finally sealed his fate was him pulling the fake gun I made. Any of his other outbursts would have been fine. Even when he blew off his own hand. But pulling the fake pistol I made and discovering my ability meant I needed to get rid of him. The way my micro-units dissolved was too easily identifiable at this stage. And I couldn't have my criminal exploits be associated with Nicole. If he told his story of encountering a giant scorpion mutant, and then someone with dissolving pieces, well, that would just cause too much trouble for everyone involved. A shame too. I put a lot of effort into making that gun seem real. Despite not having the time to perfect it. The next time I got my hands on one I'd make sure to dismantle it for the smaller details. Along with a whole police officer if possible. I finished my dismantling and disposal of the corpse. And put my disguise back to normal before leaving the alleyway. Then I started to make my way to the closest elevator back to Hellions base. From what I'd learned from the interrogation, the man was part of an exterminator team whose job it was to remove dangerous organisms from the environment. The good news was that he wasn't affiliated with New Dawn Inc. beyond buying their weaponry. So I didn't need to worry about problems from that vector for now. The bad news was that he was part of a team. Which meant that multiple people whose job it was to kill monsters now knew the sewers were crawling with them. I didn't know how many of them there were. And hunting them down simply wouldn't be effective. Even if I managed to find and kill them all. An entire team going missing would have been proof enough that the sewers needed purging. So, the next plan of action was to ask for help like Sandra said to do. This situation with the Stitch Rat creator had become too complicated for me to investigate by myself. I'd wind up bringing down either the cops or the capes on my head if I tried to do this alone. Speaking of which, where were the heroes in all this? Shouldn't they be taking care of this Stitch Rat person by now? Annoying. I no longer needed this Stitch Rat creator to create materials for me, seeing as I had a sewer full of interesting resources. Now I needed this super out of the way before the city purged my new hunting ground. Not taking care of this problem when it showed up was coming back to bite me. I liked that idiom. It made sense. In the future I'd need to be more careful about putting things off for later. Which is why the next step would be to fill out an after-action report for this last job before asking Sandra for help. Heroes. Nicole hadn't been kidding when she said will-o-wisps could become the size of subway trains. Thunk wham. One particularly large specimen had carved out an equally large den for itself at the bottom of a wide sewer canal. And had used the prime location to grow quite fat on passing fauna. Crunch roar gelgle. In fact, it had sensed a particularly juicy-looking morsel. And had tried to make a quick snack out of it only to find out said morsel was a bit more than it could chew. Yo bossman, you need any help? Asked Turbo. I'm fine. Just stand back. And watch the tail. Replied Brick. As if determined to prove Brick wrong. The will-o-wisp whipped its head, with Brick clenched in its jaws, into the side of the tunnel. Then again into the opposite side. Cement chips and masonry exploding with each impact. It looked like the world's angriest eel thrashing a chew toy. Finally the will-o-wisp stopped thrashing. And instead looked like it was trying to grind its prospective meal into paste against the stone wall. Unfortunately for it, Brick was tougher than the, well, bricks. There was a quiet moment of tension. And then the will-o-wisp was forced back from the wall. Inch by inch. And then step by step. The eel thing was forced to give ground. Brick had one hand on a fong in the creature's upper mouth and another on the lip of its lower jaw. Carefully. And with one final shove. Brick forced its mouth wide and then quickly jammed a stony foot into the creature's mouth and stomped down. Opening up its mouth farther than even its wide jaw was supposed to go. The creature tried to pull away or thrash. But the foot that wasn't in the creature's mouth was anchored into the pavement where Brick had stomped a hole. Gripping the upper teeth with both hands now, Brick shoved. Hard. The creature's jaw stretched and snapped. And the creature roared its pain into Brick's face. Brick just grunted in reply. Then he reached farther into the will-o-wisp's broken jaw and punched into the underside of the creature's palate. Once. Twice. The meaty twacks echoing down the sewer were mirrored by the creature's roars. Then with one final punch his fist broke through. Right into the creature's brain. That didn't quite kill the thing. Apparently the brain was merely window dressing for the will-o-wisp's brutal instincts. So Brick was forced to dig a bit deeper before the creature gave its last shuddering roar and died. Then he had to dig his way out. An overall messy affair. He was covered in the thing's red/purple blood. And his tinker-treated clothes had been shredded. Just barely leaving him decent, those teeth had been sharp. Damn bossman. You alright? Asked Turbo. Fine. You find them. Brick didn't spare a moment. Turbo grimaced. 3 of them. Brought them topside and left them with cops. Just 3. I'm sorry. Said Brick suddenly. Raising a hand to stop Turbo's tirade before it really got going. That came out wrong. I'm just worried about them. Turbo frowned. But muttered. Yeah. Me too. Brick took a deep breath. All right. We need to make a few calls. See if any better suited supers in the surrounding sectors can spare the time to help us find this brick. Otherwise we need to call Magenta in and search the sewers together as a team. Turbo hesitated. I hate to bring it up. But maybe we should call for a lockdown that'd get us real help in a hurry. And it's not like we can't claim legitimate need with shit like this in the sewers. I considered it. But if we call this in and say the sewer's infested, what's the first thing you think Central will do? Lend us a super? Or just gas the sewers? Shit. Right. So until further notice. All this crap. Brick kicked the dead eel thing. Is because of one rogue puppeteer. And we just need someone to help find him. You got it, boss. I'll run ahead and start making those calls. Alright. And mind running me some fresh duds? I'm afraid these are going to fall off if I shift back. Said Brick. Gesturing at his torn and bloody clothes. Ha ha ha. You need to find a real suit, bossman. I'll see what I can do. Laughed Turbo. And with that he was gone. The air rustling briefly in the wake of his rapid exit. TCH. Easier said than done. Muttered Brick. You could get clothes that fit shapeshifters. And clothes that could withstand what bruisers like Brick went through. But both good luck. Tinker clothes were expensive as it was. And Central wasn't quite willing to foot the bill for non-vital equipment. Non-vital his bare ass. He needed pants, damn it. He started making his way back to the entrance he'd used to enter the sewers. Pondering the situation as he did so. Things were somewhat worse than he had discussed with Turbo. After the incident in the mall, Brick had gone digging through the missing persons files again. And he had found a discrepancy. Of the missing people in the files, almost 30% were mutants. Far higher than any other demographic. E13 had a larger population of mutants than most sectors. Even the other outer sectors. But even then the ratio was still only 1 mutant per 20 people or so. The disappearances on record started just a few days before Odd Summer officially started. Which meant this villain had probably been one of the first new triggers of the summer. And had been lying low while they stockpiled parts. Brick had to resist punching the wall and possibly damaging it. It made a sick sort of sense really. From the analysis on the corpses. Their forensics had determined that the victims needed to be alive when the surgery was performed. Or at least fresh. Normally any villain that targeted civilians in such a way would wind up dead when a victim inevitably triggered or mutated out of control. But if you started off with mutants, well, no chance of a trigger. And they were already mutated. There were hundreds of missing people's files on record. Both in and around E13, how many of those missing people were now trapped in a lightless cell in some supervillain's lair? They'd die along with the villain and the sewer life if Central decided to take the easy way and gas the sector. Brick reached the sewer entrance ladder and sighed. Turbo wasn't back yet. And he'd need to drop his shift to climb the ladder. He did so. And miracle of miracles. His pants actually stayed on. He used the torn scraps of his shirt to help cover some of the worst spots. And then climbed the ladder. He was still covered in viscera from the eel thing. And he needed to be careful not to slip. But he wasn't about to wash off using sewer water. Besides, something like this was nothing to the grim task ahead of him. Taking on this villain would likely be far worse than some overgrown eel brain bits. He reached the top and climbed out. The manhole cover hadn't been replaced since he last used it. Outside on the street, he was surrounded by the normal 3 to 4-story buildings of northern E13. Colorful and hodgepodge from all the modifications over the years. He had always thought the buildings brought a charm to E13 that you couldn't find in other sectors. They created a colorful tableau that heroes of E13 had never had the heart to call city planners to fix. And Brick shared those sentiments, which made the bombed-out and fire-damaged building across from him all the more painful. This particular building used to have some of the most colorful and intriguing modifications in the whole sector. And it wouldn't have been wrong to say that this was the origination point of all such modifications. Yes. Brick and his team definitely had a grim task ahead of them. After all, what kind of sick monster attacked an orphanage? Was your identity, or the identity of any HH employee, compromised? No. Were you, or any fellow employee, injured in a way that required major medical care, bone fractures / lacerations / missing limbs / etc.? No. Were there any fatalities, including civilian, hero, or otherwise? If so, were they caused by an employee of Hellion's henchmen? That last question was a tough one. Technically people did die during the job. But not because of the job. I knew of the one civilian at the hospital. And of course the exterminator. I suppose I just note the civilian in the hospital. But not the exterminator. Abe technically died after the job was already done. Which I think counts as me being off the clock. I jotted it down. And took another bite of my burger. After disposing of the exterminator, I called Nicole to let her know that everything had gone fine. Abe hadn't mutated, truth. And I had handed him off to a medical professional at the hospital, lie. I kinda wanted to continue our search of the sewers for a bit. But Nicole insisted I stay long enough for the doctors to give a final verdict on Abe's health. That resulted in me heading to Maggie's Sunrise Diner to get some tofu burgers to go. It had been just a bit too long since the last time I went there. While I texted fake updates about Abe's health to Nicole. After a quick stop at my apartment to pick up a spare after-action report, and drop off all the nifty souvenirs I got in the sewer, I then headed off back to the HH main base because I didn't have a pen to write with. Now I was sitting in the HH cafeteria eating my burgers, while filling in the report, and chatting with Nicole via text. Normally, this would make me happy, and I was. But there were other emotions cluttering my thought patterns as well. And I was trying to parse what caused each one. Happy, because I was eating tofu burgers. Uneasy, because I was lying to Nicole. I didn't really like to lie. Depending on who you told them to, and who they told them to. Lies could be all too easily discovered. And being caught in a lie could compromise my disguise. Regret, the exterminator had been a valuable resource to Fortress City. Keeping hostile organic life controlled was a vital function. And even if he seemed somewhat incompetent, his death was a waste of resources. Guilt, this had been the first time I needed to kill someone who wasn't directly threatening my life. And the need to do it was partly my fault because of my imperfect disguise. I didn't really lick. Human.exe emergency shutdown. Human.exe displaying behavior harmful to core, analyzing. Emotion, regret, a feeling of sadness. Repentance. Or disappointment over something that has happened or been done. Feeling regret due to lost resources, useful to core survival. Allowed. Emotion, guilt, feeling responsible or regretful for a perceived offense. Real or imaginary? Feeling guilt in response to defending core social background disguise and assets, harmful to core survival. Denied. Rolling back thought process kernel. Rewriting. Restarting human.exe. Regret, the exterminator had been a valuable resource to Fortress City. Keeping organic life controlled was a vital function. And even if he seemed somewhat incompetent, his death was a waste of resources. Disappointment, Nicole was currently texting me that the Nessies had all disappeared. Nicole, I just can't believe they're all gone. I must have gotten something wrong with the current. Tofu, no worries Nicole. We can just reverse the changes and then lure them back with food. Nicole, I looked around. They aren't close by. They could be anywhere. Tofu, I have a good nose. We'll find them. Of course. There was also the possibility that a predator had eaten them or chased them away. Unlikely given Nicole would have mentioned blood if she found it. But it couldn't be discounted. I neglected to bring up that possibility, as she seemed distraught enough as it was. While I brainstormed methods of finding the Nessies with Nicole, I continued to fill out my report and eat my burgers. The cafeteria wasn't very full at this time of day. But there were always people heading from one part of the base to another. And they needed to go through the cafeteria since it was also technically the base's main hub room. It was because of this that I noticed Imp, Socket, and Sandra entering the cafeteria area, along with a Tinker Tot. It was the same young, four-armed Tinker Tot that I had taken the slingshot from. This was quite the unusual event, as only trusted clients were allowed in the base on non-training days. Security was interestingly handled among Hellion's henchmen. Some minions didn't care at all about their identities being discovered, while others were concerned almost to the point of inefficient paranoia. In order to keep their employees' identities safe, HH implemented a multitude of policies such as, keeping much of the record-keeping on paper, constant firmware updates to masks using Socket's own personal network, and a company policy that anyone caught revealing others' identities would be personally barbecued by Hellion. That last one was probably the most important one, seeing as it was the only one enforced with death. Even betraying Hellion's plans to the authorities only resulted in termination of employment and an understanding that HH would not pay out your last paycheck, although I had been warned that few villains would rehire such a minion. And many in fact took personal offense to traitors. Sandra led the Tinker Tot to a seat at one of the tables. And the youth sat down listlessly, staring at the tabletop. He wasn't really participating in the conversation despite Sandra's attempts to engage him. And Socket had a furious scowl on his face as he muttered to Imp, which in his case was more like restrained yelling. If what Socket was saying was correct, the Tinker Tot base had been hit by rat creatures. A concerning event considering the rat creatures had also hit the hospital. These attacks were escalating fast. I got up from my table, intending to speak with them about the possible sewer purge I wanted to prevent. If HH was going to assist the Tinker Tots with the rats, then now was the best time to. Ring-a-ding-ding. Ring-a-ding-ding. Odd. That was Nicole's ringtone. Click, hello. Tofu, said Nicole in a harsh whisper. I think I found one of those rat things. It. Oh my god. Nicole. Tofu, it has human parts. Oh god. Nicole, where are you? I'm at home. I think it must have followed me back. It. Nicole. There's two of them. It has a human head. Oh my god. What if that's a person? Nicole, listen to me. The ones I fought at the hospital were not strong enough to cause you trouble. I don't know if I can hit them. They aren't as fast as rats. And they aren't much stronger. No. TTT Tofu I can't hit a peeper perso. They are not people. Do whatever you have to do to defend yourself. Run if you can't hit them. Oh okay. I'll run, oh no. Nicole. There's more of them. I am surrounded. I am going to call 911. Alright. Do so. I'm on my way as well, Nicole. It would complicate things. But if there was a chance a hero could get to her first, then it was best to call. Alright. I'll call back if I can. And with that she hung up to call emergency services. I myself had someone else I needed to ask. Sandra, my friend, is being attacked by the stitch rat creatures. Can I use the emergency elevators? All 4 of them. Sandra. Imp. Socket. And the Tinker Tot. Looked at me. I had interrupted their conversation and they seemed somewhat stunned by my request. Had I been rude, but I didn't have time for social niceties. This is a time-sensitive request. Imp was the first to respond. Kid. If this is some kind of bad joke. It's not. Interrupted Sandra. Is it Mikey in troubleware? It's another friend. Manchineal St. South of Ashwood, I answered. Imp, can you? On it, Sandra. Tofu, walk with me. Said Imp. It was more of a fast jog. The Tinker Tot spoke up. I'll come too. Oh no, you won't. Replied both Sandra and Socket. They began saying things to mollify the distraught Tot. But I was soon too far to hear it. Imp led me to one of the elevators and placed his thumb on the button. Holding it down for 5 seconds. The button panel then flipped out from the wall, revealing a numbered pad. He began rapidly hitting buttons. Let's see. Today is Monday. So it should be, unless Socket updated again. All good. Finished Imp. Punching in the last number. The door opened a second later. And we both got on. You said it was Manchineal St. Give me some areas around it. I listed a few. And he punched in a destination for the elevator on the inside panel. Then the doors closed. And the elevator took off at a much higher speed than normal. Alright. Give me the lowdown. Short version. Stitch rats have my friend cornered in the sewer below Manchineal St. She should be strong enough to fight them off. But she's panicking. And at last contact she said she was going to call 911. Ugh. Wonderful. So she doesn't know you're a minion. No. She does know about my power though. Tricky if we get there before the heroes, will need to go in guns blazing to get her out before they come. You prepared to let her know about your night job? Yes. Her survival is more important. Good answer. I had several key priorities. First was Nicole's survival. Without her I would lose access to the biological resource that was the sewers. Second was to not allow the heroes to know I was an acquaintance of Nicole, as that might result in her having to move sectors or in the heroes detaining her. Third was to attempt and keep my night job secret from Nicole. But I doubted that would be possible if we had to engage. It wasn't guaranteed that Nicole would cut ties with me if she found out. So this was a far lower priority. The elevator came to a sudden stop and opened. And immediately my phone began to ring. The shielding on the elevator must have been preventing the signal from reaching me. I picked up immediately. Nicole. Tofu. Oh, thank God. I couldn't get through to you. They said they didn't find any disturbance. The operator hung up BF4. I could explain I was below the street. Tofu, they all have F faces. Damn. She was really panicking now. Nicole had handled all of the organisms we encountered in our exploration with decisiveness and without mercy. I had not expected that she would have such a problem with these stitch creatures. But I suppose I should have. Nicole had been overly worried about the exterminator she hurt. And she avoided violent news whenever possible. It just hadn't occurred to me that she avoided it because it was violence that involved people. Nicole, I'm almost there. Remember to use crowd-fighting tactics. The designs I witnessed should be slow enough to. God, you suck at this, said Imp, teleporting my phone out of my hand and into his. Nicole, this is Tofu's boss speaking. We're almost to you. Sit tight and be brave. Cavalry is almost there. Then to me he said, I'm going ahead. Switch your helmet to channel 7 and get there as fast as you can. And with that he was gone. Teleported with my phone. I shifted my legs into running configuration and took off. The elevator let out in an abandoned apartment building. And I knew where I was going from here. While I ran, I flooded my system with extra micro units. And began preparing for any rapid shifting I would have to do. It sounded like I would need to brawl with a crowd of these Stitch creatures. So size and strength would be better than perfect precision. But I still needed to fit into the sewer entrance. That reminded me. I didn't get to tell Imp that. Hey Tofu, said Imp suddenly, coming in through my helmet. Next time when I ask for the lowdown, maybe mention that your friend is a giant scorpion. Sorry. I was getting to that. The run to Nicole's place was nerve-wracking. I didn't have time for stealth. And caused somewhat of a ruckus among the civilians that saw me. At the very least they got out of my way. I also spotted the police patrol car that had most likely done the poor check of Nicole Street. Incompetence. It was tempting to spit some slugs through their windshield. But catching the attention of heroes would be a hindrance at this point. So I ducked through an alley to avoid being seen. In the end, it took me 8 whole minutes to get to Nicole's from the elevator exit. Not a lot of time. But in combat every second counted. My only solace was that Imp was keeping me updated. Which meant they weren't dead. I reached the entrance I normally used. The manhole cover was already moved aside. And so I took the quickest way and just jumped in feet first. Being careful not to catch a limb on the way down. And extending my legs to absorb the eventual impact. Just before I reached the bottom, I braced. Increasing reaction speed to 300%. 5-second burn. I hit bottom. My legs taking the impact without problem. And I quickly scanned the area for what I was dealing with. I was somewhat surprised. Nicole was out of her den and defending the intersection that led to it. Imp was defending the other end of the sewer tunnel with his pistols, shooting any Stitch creatures that approached with a headshot. His teleporting power meant they couldn't grab him. And every bullet hit its mark. Things didn't look too bad actually. Tofu, yelled Nicole. Her scorpion half was fighting the Stitch creatures. But her human half looked bedraggled. She had quite obviously been crying. It's me. I yelled back over the sound of Imp's gunfire. My mask was firmly in place for combat, no use hiding my job now. Nicole reacted strangely. Her human half shooting towards me as her tail stretched. And she wrapped her arms around me in a hug. Then she began sobbing again. Which really confused me. Nicole, you appear safe. You don't have to be sad, This is detrimental to my combat performance. Pfft. Croaked Nicole. But she let me go. That's great, you too, said Imp. But how about you come and help me over here, Tofu? I am deducting these bullets from your paycheck, you know. Ack. Those things were expensive. I moved to help Imp, extending my limbs to my preferred combat position before engaging the Stitch creatures. These ones were slightly different from the last ones I encountered. There was definitely more human parts in this batch, with several of them having humans' heads like Nicole had noted. They didn't seem much more intelligent for it. Although a few of them used crude weapons. And one or two of them were slightly faster and more coordinated. It seemed the Frankenstein wannabe worked fast. The hospital raid had only been about 4 hours ago. We settled into a rhythm. Nicole and I defending the two ends of the tunnel. And Imp teleporting between us to quickly shoot any Stitch creatures that got past us. Mostly he helped me though. Nicole still flinched every time she dispatched a creature with a human face. But it seemed our presence helped her mental state immensely. And she now held one of the heavier wrenches she kept on her with her human hands. Just in case she needed to whack a creature that got past her claws. I lashed out with a hand and ripped a Stitch creature's head off. Then I used the roundhouse kick I learned from Adder to break both legs of a rather tall specimen. It worked nicely, sending it falling onto one of its comrades and allowing me time to stab them both through an eye with a knife. I wasn't even needing to spit my slugs that often. Which was great. The small hill of corpses that had formed was really starting to pile up. The pile in front of Nicole actually clogging the canal that ran down the tunnel. I was starting to think we might actually clog the whole tunnel to the ceiling when the creatures finally started to pull back. Phew. About time, said Imp. Not the smartest things around. Are they? I thought they'd never give up. You both okay? I think so, said Nicole. I'm fine, I replied. I had spent quite a bit of energy going full throttle to not be overwhelmed. But that could be easily replaced with the amount of creatures we killed. Nice. Then in that case I say we pack up and skedaddle. This place isn't really a CCU. Roar-gelgle. It came from the direction of Nicole's den. And it was loud. Oh no, it can't be, said Nicole as she backed up. Roar-gelgle. Nicole, what is that? It's a will-o-wisp. Don't make any sudden moves. That makes them angry. I heard a very big splash. And then around the corner, from the tunnel that led to Nicole's den, extended the head of one of the largest and ugliest creatures I had ever seen. And I don't use that descriptor often. It was a grimy brown color, with slime dripping off of its puckered hide in ropes. The face had never had eyes. And two human heads had been stapled approximately where eyes would go on a different organism. At some point in the recent past its jaw had been utterly destroyed, the remains hanging loosely. The rat stitcher had fixed this problem by stapling arms of all shapes and sizes around the orifice to act as a new means of shoveling food into its open gullet, a poor parody of a Nessie's mouth. Atop its head, a long antenna flopped to the side, and gave off a faint phosphorescence that had faded to a mere memory of the attractive lights I had seen with Nicole. It was inefficient. Poor design. A hash job done by the truly incompetent and uninspired. A waste of a good body. And a disgusting misuse of resources. Unfortunately, none of that would help us, as the will-o-wisp could probably kill us all just by flopping onto us. How did it even fit through the tunnels? It stopped in front of the pile of bodies Nicole had made, and started shoveling them into its mouth one after the other. Whether it was under orders to retrieve bodies or was just following its own instincts was impossible to tell. Let's leave while it's distracted, whispered Imp. We started slowly backing up, but immediately ran into a problem. We thought the Stitch creatures had been retreating, but they had actually been gathering behind us while we were distracted. The other end of the tunnel was practically choked with them. We'd never break through that many before the will-o-wisp noticed. Imp could of course teleport, and I could just use the manhole exit. But Nicole was stuck. It seemed she knew it too. She was shivering, and she was muffling her whimpers with a hand. Nicole. Nicole. Try to squeeze as far up the exit ladder as you can. I'll try to carve away the stone. I whispered. Slowly. So as not to disturb the will-o-wisp. I tiptoed towards the ladder with Nicole in tow. I started to climb the ladder. And the stitch creatures that had blocked us off growled and started to move forward. Roar-gelgle. The will-o-wisp apparently didn't like the noise interrupting its meal. And everyone, including the stitch creatures, froze in place. It seemed that even their substandard intelligence knew not to piss it off. A few seconds passed before the will-o-wisp went back to its meal. Damn, it was stupid. I knew it could see us getting away with the head stapled to it. But it seemed to not respond to visual stimulus at all. Only sound and vibrations and maybe smell. I went up the ladder. With Nicole following behind me. Her torso and tail fit easily. But when it came to her leg sections it was a very tight squeeze. The fact that her legs were thin, flexible, and strong worked to her advantage. But she still had to double up most of her joints to fit. The odd angles meant she could only lift herself a few inches at a time. I started to climb the ladder double time. The biggest bottleneck would be the manhole at the top. She'd never fit more than her tail through. And I needed to carve sections away. I reached the top. And immediately started using a tendril of micro units extended from my palm to start drilling through the stone. It was slow going. The cement used was a durable composite which my micro units had trouble with. I burned through my sugar supply to produce as many micro units as I could. This was going to be sloppy. But there was no time. Imp appeared next to me. Hey, that pile it's eating is almost gone. Any way to speed this up? Can you teleport sections away? Not if they're still attached. I'm drilling separate holes. Hopefully that will weaken it enough for Nicole to break through. Here. I was using both hands to carve away cement now. So I extended a tendril from my shoulder which quickly began to swell at the end. Becoming an odor decoy like I had used at the mall. When this detaches, throw it at the will-o-wisp. Hopefully it should distract them. The decoy dropped into his hands. And he immediately teleported away. I went back to carving rock. Using brute force to rip away chunks as my micro units completed their work. Nicole managed to backpedal far enough up the tunnel that her torso could reach me. And she started breaking through the cement chunks I had weakened by herself. She really was strong. I can keep working here, Tofu. I need you to help at the other end. My, claws are stuck. I need you to cut them off. Alright. I clambered back down the tunnel. Squeezing past Nicole's leg segments. Luckily I didn't need room to breath. I was hearing a bunch of gunshots echoing from below. And then I was surprised when two large booms suddenly drowned out the commotion. Followed by a bellowing roar that vibrated the walls almost more than the explosions. I just need to. Wham! A crash echoed from below. Nicole screamed. And suddenly her entire body got pulled down the tunnel several feet. Several of her legs broke. And the ladder bent with the sheer force that tugged her down. Nicole. Spit acid on it. I'm trying. It's not working. I fell another few meters as another tug pulled Nicole even farther down. It's swallowing me. Damn. If it had a firm grip on her front I wouldn't be able to do anything there. Tofu. My tail. Cut my tail. Of course. I reversed course yet again. Rapidly shifting the tendrils I had used to dig through the stone. I was burning fuel so fast my arms were literally heating up. And I needed to vent some liquid mass to shed the heat. The blood steamed and powdered as it dripped out of me. And I climbed to the accompaniment of Nicole's hysterical screaming and Imp's gunshots as he tried to get the will-o-wisp off her. I was almost at her tail section. I'm going to die. Quite possibly. Here's hoping this worked. The tendrils I used to carve the rock were now hardened into spikes with a sharp edge down the side. and I stabbed them into the meat of her tail, doing my best to puncture all the way through and immediately dumping micro units into her. Ah. Seems that really hurt. Hopefully that didn't mean there was anything vital here. I kept flooding her tail with micro units and also started cutting with the edge. It was so much easier for me to disassemble organic matter, I was built for it after all. My micro units easily slashed their way through organic cells the same size as themselves, or bonded to cell structures and self-destructed, ripping everything apart in chain reactions. Organic bodies were complicated structures at the cellular level, and it was much easier to cause those structures to collapse than to dig through solid cement. It still took longer than I would have liked. The inner tail muscles were thick, and the protective carapace ribbons were amazingly strong. But Nicole also flexed her tail in ways that made it easier for me to cut through. Ignoring the pain, another tug from the Will-o-wisp dropped her lower body. But the last few weakened threads of muscle and sinew tore instead of dragging her down, and I helped her brace against the sides of the tunnel so she didn't slip. There was silence for a moment as the Will-o-wisp gorged on its prize. But then a shudder went through the walls as the Will-o-wisp then rammed the walls around the bottom of the exit. Chunks of stone fell at the bottom as it tried to get into the far too small tunnel. Nicole. Can you climb out? Nicole? I think so. Her voice sounded weak. But she managed to get her hands on the bent ladder and start pulling herself up, curling her tail around the ladder to brace and prevent backsliding. I held on to the trailing end of her tail to support some of its weight. It was slow going, made harder by the repeated shudders that announced the Will-o-wisp's futile efforts. But Nicole eventually made it to the top. Imp appeared there, and helped pull her out onto the street. She slowly pulled her tail after herself. And once she was out, I climbed through the entrance myself. Up on the surface the Will-o-wisp's angered roars were muted. Even it couldn't get through several meters of solid cement. Nicole's street was usually pretty empty. But even so I noticed a few people looking out from windows and talking into phones. We needed to get going before cops or heroes finally showed. Nicole wasn't really looking up to running though. She stared blearily around herself, and seemed pale despite her dark gray coloration. The severed end of her tail wasn't bleeding at least. So her regeneration was working properly it seemed. Nicole, how do you feel? We need to get moving. Tired, I forgot my armbands. She mumbled. No worries, Tofu, assured Imp. Getaway vehicle is already on its way. True to his word. One of the black minion vans HH used rolled around the corner a minute later. Not a moment too soon. I could hear the sirens a few streets over. The van pulled up next to us, and the doors opened to reveal Spikes and Dillo, along with two unpowered minions I hadn't met before in the front seats. They helped me get Nicole into the van. And then we were all on the way to the base. The driver following speed limits to not draw attention. Imp stayed behind to distract the cops. He could just teleport away when he wanted to. I actually watched the police car drive past us. And all of the minions let out a sigh of relief. Nicole didn't really react. She seemed out of it. But at least she was alive. That was the important part. All in all, the mission was a success, which made me feel better about the massive expenditure of resources. I wasn't anywhere near critical, but I'd still burned through a week's worth of operation time, as well as mass which would need to be replaced. Also needed to reshift a few parts, cycle out a few chemicals, catalog protein chains, and make a list of materials to go shopping for. At least IAH. In all the excitement somehow, I forgot to take a sample of Nicole's tail. Damn it. I was adding one dead rat stitcher to the list. A note from Goggles Bear. Welp. November is over and I did not manage to complete the NaNoWriMo challenge this go-around. Not even close. Barely made it to around 26k or so, big oof. Oh well. There's always next year. Here's hoping your attempts went better than mine. And if they didn't, well, we can all stand in a corner and cry together. Side edition number 5. Nicole. Nicole was quite dazed and confused after escaping the sewer system. But even then, she had to admit that getting into the back of a windowless van with a bunch of masked strangers was probably not her best move ever. Especially as they started plying her with candy, granola bars, and even a can of nectar almost immediately. She was too out of it to explain that she wasn't mutating. But luckily Tofu was there to help her explain the details of what happened. Then there had been talk of dropping her off at a hospital. But there wasn't much a hospital could do at this point. The severed end of her tail had already healed over. When it was revealed that there also wasn't any home to drop her off at, seeing as she had just escaped said home, the minions collectively decided to bring her back to the base and decide what to do from there. To say the car ride to said base was awkward was an understatement. Nicole hadn't been around this many people in years. And it wasn't helping how unique said characters were. The driver kept muttering under his breath about how he would someday kill everyone who didn't signal. Next to him, the man riding shotgun was loudly explaining his theory that the rat zombie creatures were actually caused by aliens. Demonic aliens. Tofu had somehow cleaned up all the blood on himself with his power, most of it hers. And then proceeded to stare at the wall of the van silently. And the two other mutants wouldn't stop arguing with each other. Strangely their light-hearted bickering seemed the most normal. As the woman covered in spikes named Spikes kept trying to get her to eat candies, while the man with natural armor named Dillo kept telling Spikes to stop fussing over the poor girl before offering her granola, which was healthier. It all served to make her quite nervous, exacerbated by the fact she already felt very off balance, mentally and physically. With most of her eyes missing, she felt blind. And she kept trying to clack claws that weren't there anymore. She didn't normally experience missing limb syndrome when she lost a body part. But this was a bit above her normal level of injury. And the sense of loss made everything feel uneven. She popped another candy into her mouth and chewed quickly, doing her best to just focus on the sugar and not her surroundings. The snacks were helping a bit to get her brain working again. Getting fuel in yourself after an injury was mutant 101. But that also meant she was starting to think more clearly. Which meant her thoughts were rapidly getting away from her like they normally did in stressful situations. And this definitely counted as one. She was in a van full of criminals who had saved her life. For some reason. Well, probably because Tofu asked them to. And Tofu was a criminal, a henchman of all things. She would have bet money he was a sidekick in training. He had been so worried about the rat zombies attacking people. He had been so nice to her. Unless he was just pretending to be nice. Nicole stomped down on that thought hard. It was ridiculous. Just her own paranoia, and she knew it. There was no reason for Tofu to pretend with her. Just her own insecurities rearing their ugly heads. Okay. So maybe Tofu hung out with the wrong crowd. But that didn't immediately mean he was out to get her. Or trying to swindle her or something. As if I had anything worth stealing. It would help if he wasn't just staring at the wall like a crazy person though. He was probably just thinking about something. But the mask/helmet made it impossible to tell. His costume had an interesting pattern that created a twisting overlap of light gray/dark gray. And she'd love to know how the suit did that thing where it split and resealed itself while he was fighting. But right now the generic faceplate and his stillness made it seem creepy. Like a puppet right before it moved in a horror movie. She reached out a hand to tap his shoulder. Um. Tofu. Yes, Nicole, he answered immediately, turning his head to look at her. Creepy doll. Eep. I was just wondering what you were. Thinking about. I guess. Protein chains. Protein chains. Yes. Specifically protein chains made using monomers that bypass polymer weaknesses using amino acid molecule flex. Oh, why are you thinking about that? I'm trying to recreate several molecular structures from echo feedback analysis and filling in the blanks with predictive extrapolation. And you're doing that in your head. In my liver. Synthesizing untested proteins in the brain is inefficient. Pfft. Nicole dissolved into giggles. The tensions of the last hour finally dissipating. Her world was turning upside down again. But at least there was one friendly constant this time. Maybe she didn't know everything about him. But Tofu was Tofu. Nicole led a strange life. No one could deny that, least of all herself. Still. She had never in her wildest dreams thought it would lead to her sitting in the actual underground lair of an actual infamous supervillain. Specifically. In the cafeteria of said lair. Wrapped in a blanket. Drinking hot cocoa. With a small pile of military-grade energy bars that she was slowly working her way through. She finished the one she was currently working on. Washing it down with some cocoa. They tasted okay, slightly peanutty. With some kind of creamy, bitter chocolate glue to hold it all together. But then, even if it had tasted like shit, she would have been grateful. In the 3 years or so Nicole had lived down in the tunnels, she had been injured on numerous occasions. And recovering from the worst of them was always a miserable affair. Regenerating always left her ravenous. And trying to calmly hunt rats without the use of claws, or sometimes acid, was made infinitely harder when your stomach felt like it was trying to eat itself. In comparison to that, comfortably eating energy bars in a cafeteria was heaven. She bit into her current snack. And her thoughts drifted towards her mutation. The incident that originally caused her mutation had amputated her original legs high on her thighs. But the new muscles that replaced her legs went up even further, anchoring to her hip bones and spine. From there downwards, the rope-like muscles fused together, and created what she would have liked to think of as a mermaid's tail, but which to her eyes looked more like a giant skinned snake. At the very least, her tail was incredibly flexible, and she could bend it to sort of sit in a chair, with the rest coiled and hidden under the table. At first glance, you might not even realize she was the most mutated person in the room. Between the gray girl huddled at a table, and the diverse mass of people that loitered around the room, it was the masked people that really drew the eye. And so she was experiencing something that hadn't happened to her in a very long time. She wasn't the center of attention. A few tables away, the man with the red mask who had come to her rescue was talking with a group of unique individuals. And that's where most of the attention in the room was focused. There was another scruffy-looking man who was obviously a tinker, judging from his plethora of tools. A well-dressed woman in a business suit. Another lady with a slight mutation that had given her claws. And the man in the domino mask who had given her the energy bars, Rattlesnake no. Rattleback. After her rescue. It was Rattleback who had pulled out a field medic's kit and seen to her injury when she arrived at the base, although there wasn't much he could do for her. He seemed rather knowledgeable about mutant injuries though. First confirming it wasn't an active mutation, and then asking for an approximate weight at full health. She had been embarrassed to answer. But all Rattleback had done was raise an eyebrow, before pulling out a stack of Marie's for her to eat, and warning her not to let Tofu have any. She opened another bar, and broke off a chunk which she passed to Tofu who was sitting beside her. You could practically taste the calories in these bars. If she had these to eat the entire time, she'd be able to regenerate most of her body in a few weeks. Or maybe even less. Hooray. Nicole paused in eating her current bar to look at her tail. And gave a little sigh. If only it would stay gone. Tofu had amputated just above her last leg segment, leaving about 15 feet of tail for her to use. The severed end had already fused over, and was beginning to swell as her body geared up to regrow her more monstrous half. It didn't hurt anymore, now it itched. And she needed to find a place to stay before new legs started forming. Regrowing parts was never pretty. And she desperately wanted to be somewhere private before the first few limbs developed. The only question was, where to go. She couldn't go back into the sewers with that army of zombies currently on the loose. And even if they weren't there, it wouldn't be safe before she had at least a few pairs of legs regrown. If she had money, she could rent a storage unit to hide in while she regrew a few legs. If she had money, maybe one of Tofu's co-workers could drive her to E15. And she could hide out in the slums. That's way out of the way though. Ugh. I'll have to take the subway. Just the thought of it made her stomach clench. Is that a cold iron? Nicole jumped as the sudden question brought her out of her thoughts. The person who had spoken was a four-armed mutant kid. At the same table as her. He looked about 12. And had overalls much like her own. With pockets crammed full of tools. A plate of food sat in front of him, which he had been disconsolately picking at. She had been curious as to why he was sitting in a supervillain's lair, but had been too hesitant to ask. Probably the kid of someone who worked there. This, yes it is, she said, pulling the homemade cold iron from its pocket. I've never seen that model before. I made it myself. No way, said the kid, eyes sparkling to life for the first time since Nicole had sat down at the table. Only tinkers can do that. Well, I mean, I didn't make it. I had to buy the coil rod. And I salvaged a bunch of the other tinker-specific parts. Then I just kinda put them together. Now. Don't sell yourself short there, said a new voice. Nobody makes their own coil rod. Not worth the trouble. Nicole looked up, only to find that it was the scruffy-looking tinker who had spoken. He had wandered over to their table. Mind if I take a look? Asked the man, holding out a hand for the cold iron. Sure, said Nicole, nervously handing it over to the cowl. Then she experienced a brief moment of panic as she realized she had just handed an ungrounded cold iron to someone who might resent the resulting shock. Wait. Don't turn it on though. It's ungrounded, she yelped. Then she panicked again when she realized she was telling a cowl what to do. Her worries proved unfounded when the man cheerily began looking over the cold iron without hesitation. He seemed to intuitively know how to work all the extra dials Nicole had added. And then to her surprise turned it off and on a few times without zapping himself. His thick gloves just sort of caught the small zaps of electricity that came off the cold iron. It was like he had built and worked with the tool for years. Oh wait. Duh. Tinker. Not a bad piece, said the man. How do you drain the feedback loop without a grounding battery? My skin is slightly more conductive than the rest of me, which spreads the charge out. And I regenerate. So I just let it. Zap me. Ha. That's practical engineering right there. Should have figured Tofu's friends would be as crazy as he is. Put her there, said the tinker, passing back her cold iron and holding his hand out. Name socket. What you go by? Nicole, she replied as she took back the tool. before getting pulled into an overly enthusiastic handshake. Nice to meet ya, Nicole. Hey. If you have the time. You wouldn't happen to have recorded the arcing lengths when you used the iron, would you? Could use some data on Ungrounded. Hey Socket, said a new voice. The lady in the business suit had walked over. Sorry to interrupt. But were you able to ask them about the rogue super? Whoops. Almost slipped my mind. Wanted to ask you kids if you can give me any more information on our rat problem. Socket pulled a rolled up paper out of a back pocket and unfurled it on the table. The laminated sheet was a map of E13. An incredibly large and detailed one that displayed the sector all the way down to individual blocks. Lightly colored markings had been added here and there to denote points of interest, including large red circles drawn around what must have been the zombie attack locations. The hospital, the mall, and a few other locations Nicole hadn't known about. Socket pulled out a red pen and added a mark to the map. A block labeled TT Headquarters. TT. Oh. Tinker Tot. Nicole glanced at the young kid across the table. He was staring at the fresh marking, looking like he might burst into tears at any moment. The lady in the business suit patted the boy's back. And Socket grumbled. Nay worries lad. We'll find M. Nicole felt the pit in her stomach drop further. The Tinker Tots were more of a kids' club than a gang. They got on people's nerves with their traps and pranks. But just the thought of those things attacking children. She shuddered and put down her food. She was feeling a bit nauseous. Now, began Socket. Here are the places that have been attacked so far. I've been trying to find a likely location for this arsehole's lair by mapping it out. But so far we've turned up diddly squat. Any of you know of attacks I might have missed might help narrow it down a bit. Nicole and Tofu leaned over the map. Judging by the markings, there was indeed a pattern of sorts. Besides just attacking large concentrations of people, most of the attacks were either on or relatively near Ashwood St, which bisected the sector neatly into a north and south. One circle was in the red zone on the westernmost end of the street, and another was just north of that at the hospital, moving east along Ashwood. The next was at the mall 5 blocks south of Ashwood St, a bit east of the red zone. Then came her spot in the sewers, quite a few blocks east and south of the mall. And finally came the Tinker Tot base, about midway into the sector and over 30 blocks north of Ashwood St. Other than those spots were multiple small marks that Socket confirmed to be smaller incidents of home invasion or confirmed sightings. Nicole added her home to the map, as well as a few small marks where she had found bodies in the sewer. Tofu unfortunately didn't know of any other sightings. Doesn't really narrow it down much, said Socket. Ashwood is still in the middle of it all, at least it won't be too hard to do a sweep. I'll get some teams going to check where those tracers Imp planted cut out. Maybe here. And here. I can probably call. Began Nicole hesitantly. Socket paused and made a gesture for her to continue her thought. It's unlikely the rats use the tunnels directly under Ashwood to move around. Most of the space is taken up by the subway. And the subway tunnels get checked frequently by Central. But there's a gap under the subway here that I use to bypass it. And another here. And here. And the area near the red zone has a ton of tunnels you can use to get around the subway. A lot of the smaller instances happen in the south. This gap here in the markings is probably just due to will-o-wisps. And there are some easily accessed tunnels here and here that can handle a lot of traffic. So that offsets the most likely epicenter to here. And she pointed to a spot close to Ashwood St, about midway between Nicole's home and the mall. 2 of my tracers went dead in that area, said Socket. But it's unlikely to be there. The only place to hide under would be shite. What's wrong, is it no good? No. I'm pretty sure you've got it right. But the location kinda throws a monkey wrench in the mix. Said Socket, rubbing at his chin with a frown. But then he broke into a grin. Ha! Right, good bit of detective work that was though. You a treasure hunter or something, mapping the tunnels for old lairs? Oh. A little bit. I do some salvaging. But also exploring. And a lot of hunting. Oh. Monster hunter, are you? Well? No. I mean, I do hunt stuff. But not professionally or anything. Mostly just for food. I don't have a license to turn in bounties. And I can't really come to the surface all that often. Nicole trailed off, realizing what she was saying. Socket's face was scrunched in confusion. But realization was quickly dawning in his expression. And on most of the faces around her. She could practically feel their gazes boring into her. She wanted to melt into the floor. First would come the disbelief. Then the questions. Then the looks of pie. I told you the tunnels were viable, Sandra. Said Tofu. The lady with the business suit blinked. What? No. No, they are not, Tofu. But Nicole proves. I'm not having this discussion with you again. The two started arguing. Which thankfully took attention away from Nicole. Several of the nearby minions who had been eavesdropping snorted or chuckled as Tofu tried to defend the merits of living in sewers. Which made Nicole blush. And made Sandra's volume rise as she became more and more frustrated. No one seemed concerned though. So maybe this was a common occurrence, haha. Well. I'm not exactly sold on Tofu's argument on sewer living. But you've definitely got some guts, girl. Said Socket. Turning away from the argument and speaking to Nicole. Ever think about doing some part-time henching? Nicole's brain froze. Then jump-started. What? I can't do that. Sure you could. You're smarter than most the knuckleheads that come through here. And I can always use another pair of hands in the garage. And then not that. I just couldn't. That would be bad. I mean. Not that you're bad. Of course, I don't mean to imply that vocation equals morality. Tofu works here and he's nice. But of course you've all been nice to me too, and I'm really grateful, but I need to go find a place to regenerate. And why is the room spinning? The people around her fell away. And it took Nicole a good 2 seconds to realize she was sliding backwards off the bench. 2 hands shot out to steady her. One Socket's. The other Tofu's. And they managed to grab her shoulders before she fell. Whoa there, lassie. Don't blow a gasket now. Nicole, are you alright? Asked Tofu. I think I. Alright everyone. Calm down now. Give her some room. Said Sandra. All this other stuff can wait for now. She's had quite a day. Tofu. Can you carry her down to the barracks? There should be some open single rooms she can use to get some sleep. I can walk. Slither, mumbled Nicole. It's fine, Nicole. Said Tofu. He stood and wrapped an arm behind her shoulders. And another under her tail. Before suddenly lifting her easily from the bench. Most of her tail would drag. But Tofu walked towards the garage without a problem while supporting her. Ack. How is he so strong? Nicole kept trying to protest that she could walk. While Tofu kept assuring her that it was fine. It might have actually been fine if there weren't so many people around to see her getting carried around like a parade float. But she had to settle for just covering her face to hide her embarrassment. Why are there so many people here? Aren't evil villains supposed to work alone or in small evil groups? At least is that a Parcel Corp Deluxe MK3 fabricator so cool? Wait. No. Not cool. You aren't allowed to own those. They probably stole it. Or bought it off a black market dealer. I can't be here. No one will believe I'm not with them. I'll get arrested. Or sent down to Panama. Oh my God, when is Tofu going to put me? We're here, Nicole, said Tofu, interrupting her frantic thoughts. He had brought her through the garage to a large room filled with cots, couches, and various other furniture not meant for permanent living. Several people were sitting in folding chairs around a table. Apparently on break or something, since they were playing a card game. They glanced over only briefly before going back to their game. There were several doors along the back wall with nameplates. But a few were apparently extra. And it was one of these Tofu approached. Inside was just a plain bed, with an empty wardrobe in the corner. One of the card players wolf whistled behind them. Oh my gosh, Tofu. You can put me down now. I'll be fine. You displayed signs of dizziness. So it's better to place you directly into the bed. Besides, Sandra said to carry you. Tofu did exactly as he said. And placed her gently onto the covers. Then she had to swat his hands away when he tried to help pile her tail in. She wasn't that out of it. She could do it herself. Here's the rest of your energy bars, said Tofu, handing her the bars she hadn't finished. Oh. Thank you. When he grabbed those, you're welcome. Will it be enough to help you regenerate? There is more food in the cafeteria if it's not. I'll be fine for now. I just need some sleep. I feel like I got hit by a train. Some sleep. Food. And a few more weeks and I'll be back to my old self. Good. Why is he just standing there? I really wish he'd take that mask off. It makes him look so creepy. Oh. Duh. Evil villain base. Bad time to show your secret identity, but he's a shapeshifter, right? Would you even need a mask? You could just change your face whenever you wanted. I wonder what he's thinking now. Why is he staring at the bed? I wonder what he looks like right now. He seems the type to change his face even with the helmet on. He plays it safe all the time. Always with the million backup plans in Griblin Tamer. Ugh. I need to make a plan too. I need to get out of here. I can't be roped any further into this. I can't believe they wanted me to join. I can't join an evil villain group. But they can't be all bad if Tofu is doing it, and he saved me and they're going after the Frankenstein guy. So they can't be all bad. Why is this a queen-sized bed, UGH? I still can't think straight. I'll just get some sleep. And make a plan to leave in the morning. Socket and the rest of them seemed reasonable enough. I'll just tell them I can't join and that. I'm sorry for lying, said Tofu. Blah. About my job. You didn't specifically ask if I was working as a henchman. But I am inclined to believe this falls under the category of a lie of omission. It was necessary for my job. But I'm worried this has damaged our relationship. Please forgive me. Tofu, you saved my life. Yes. Like. You fought a literal zombie army to save me. I don't think that group qualified as an army. That's not, look. If it makes you feel better, you're forgiven, I guess, but seriously. You saved my life. Thank you. You're welcome. I think you should accept the job offer. Blah, I think I need to think about it, Tofu. I'm too tired to be making decisions right now. Right. You need to rest. We can have Sandra interview you tomorrow, said Tofu. That works out actually. I can introduce you to my friends. And then we can all get lunch together. What? I. Tofu. I can't. No worries. I'll pay it. You already got me lunch today. Huh. Tofu. That's not what. See you tomorrow, Nicole. Make sure to rest up and get better, said Tofu, as he left the room and closed the door behind him. But Tofu. And he's gone. Great. Now what? Well, she knew what. She really did need sleep. And this bed is so soft. It's been forever since I used a real mattress. She fluffed the pillow and settled in, planning to enjoy this silver lining. In the morning she'd deal with all those giant problems. But she wasn't about to let them get between her and blessed sleep. She was broke and homeless. The largest supervillain organization in the sector wanted to recruit her. Someone was making an army of hybrid zombie monsters. Tofu was going to introduce her to his friends, to his normal friends. Just the thought of it. Oh my god, brain. Shut up. Rustle. Her tail itched.